When the laws of the world fail, the shadows take over to settle the final score for those who were wronged. Witness the cold and calculated path of people who refuse to let betrayal go unpunished. Hit subscribe now and watch how justice is truly served in the dark.
Stamp on my termination letter read, 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. I remember because I had checked my phone exactly 4 minutes before that, and my countdown app still showed 96 hours and 4 minutes remaining until my stock options vested. 4 minutes later, the CFO's son walked into my office, set a manila envelope on my desk, and told me to have my things out by end of day. His name was Brandon. He was 31 years old. He had worked at the company for 14 months. I had worked there for 22 years. I did not yell. I did not cry. I picked up the envelope, read the single page inside, and asked him one question. "Does your father know you're doing this?" Brandon straightened his jacket and said, "This decision came from leadership." Then he walked out. I sat in that chair for about 2 minutes. Just sat there. Outside my window, the parking lot of the Meridian Biosciences campus looked exactly like it always had. Gray asphalt, a row of Bradford pear trees someone had planted in 2009, the flagpole where the company flag had been replaced with a new logo banner 6 weeks ago when the acquisition talks went public. $263 million. That was the number everyone in the building was whispering about. Hartwell Pharmaceutical wanted to acquire us, and the deal was supposed to close in 5 days. I had spent the last 18 months making sure that deal would close. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. The details matter, and the specific language in a contract I signed 22 years ago matters most of all. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 54 years old. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the son of a machinist and a school librarian. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, studied biochemical engineering. Graduated in the middle of my class, not the top, not the bottom, and took a job at a small pharmaceutical research company called Meridian Biosciences in Columbus because they were the only ones who called me back. That was 1999. I was 27 years old. Meridian had 43 employees and occupied one floor of an office building near the airport. The founder, a man named Gerald Hartley, no relation to Hartwell Pharmaceutical, just an unfortunate coincidence everyone would later find ironic, was 60 years old and had built the company around a single proprietary process for accelerating drug compound stability testing. It was not glamorous work. We were not curing cancer. We were helping other companies test whether their drugs would hold up on a shelf for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. Stability work. The kind of thing that nobody thinks about until it fails. I met my wife, Diane, in 2001. She was a regulatory affairs specialist at a company 2 floors above us in the same building. We met in the elevator. She was carrying a stack of FDA submission binders, and I held the door open. We talked for 45 seconds. I asked if she wanted to get coffee sometime. She said she wanted to get coffee sometime. She said she was busy. I said I would ask again. She laughed. I asked again 3 weeks later. She said yes. We got married in 2004. By then I had been at Meridian for 5 years and had been promoted twice. Gerald Hartley called me into his office one afternoon in March of that year, 2 weeks before the wedding, and told me he wanted to renegotiate my employment contract. I want to be precise about what happened in that meeting, because it became the center of everything 22 years later. Gerald Hartley was not a warm man, but he was a fair one. He told me he had watched me for 5 years. He said I was not the most brilliant person in the building. He actually said that, directly, without apology, but that I was the most reliable. He said brilliance without reliability was just expensive chaos. He said he was getting older and he needed people he could trust to protect what he had built. He said the company was his life's work, and he intended to make sure it outlasted him intact. Then he slid a contract across the desk. The employment agreement was 31 pages. Most of it was standard. Non-disclosure. Non-disclosure. Non-solicitation. Intellectual property assignment. But on page 24, there was a clause that Gerald had written himself. I know he wrote it himself because his attorney later told me that she had advised against it and that Gerald had insisted. The clause stated, in summary, that in recognition of long-term service and contributions to company stability, Any employee who had served for 15 or more years and held a senior technical role would be entitled to accelerated vesting of all outstanding equity compensation in the event of termination, without cause within 180 days of a qualifying corporate transaction, defined as any merger, acquisition, or change of control event exceeding $50 million in transaction value. In plain English, if the company was being sold and they fired me without a good reason in the 6 months before the deal closed, every stock option I had accumulated would vest immediately. All of them, not just the ones that were already vested. I read that clause 4 times sitting in Gerald's office. Then I looked up. Why? I asked. Gerald leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Because I have seen what happens when companies sell. The people who built the thing get cleaned out right before the money arrives. The new owners want their own people. The old loyalists become inconvenient. I am not going to let that happen to the people who helped me build this. I signed the contract that afternoon. Gerald Hartley died of a stroke in 2011. His daughter inherited controlling interest in the company. The company continued to grow. I became vice president of process development in 2013. By 2023, Meridian had 412 employees and revenues of $81 million annually. And in January of 2025, Hartwell Pharmaceutical made an offer to acquire us for $263 million. The due diligence process lasted 18 months. I was the primary technical liaison. I spent those 18 months preparing documentation, answering questions, flying to meetings in Boston and San Diego, and twice to the Hartwell headquarters in Zurich. I knew every patent in our portfolio. I knew every regulatory filing. I knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. And I knew how to explain them in language that made Hartwell's lawyers comfortable rather than alarmed. The deal was scheduled to close on a Friday. On the Monday of that same week, with 96 hours remaining, Brandon Calloway walked into my office. Brandon's father, Richard Calloway, had become our CFO in 2019 after Gerald's daughter brought in an outside management team. Richard was competent enough. Brandon had been hired 14 months ago as a strategic integration advisor, which was a title that had not previously existed at Meridian, and which, as far as I could tell, meant he attended meetings and occasionally reorganized the catering orders for board lunches. I found out later, much later, what had happened. Hartwell's integration plan, which I had helped draft, included a senior technical advisor role for the post-acquisition period. The compensation package for that role included a significant equity stake in the combined entity. Richard Calloway had decided he wanted that role for Brandon. There was one problem. The role description had been written around my background, my expertise, and my relationships with the Hartwell team. As long as I was employed at Meridian and available for transition, Hartwell would expect me to fill it. Brandon could not step into that role while I was standing next to it, so I had to be removed. Brandon handed me that envelope on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday evening, I was sitting on the back porch of our house in Westerville with Diane, and I told her everything. She listened, without interrupting. That is one of the things I have always loved about my wife. 21 years of marriage, and she has never once tried to finish my sentences. She let me talk until I was done, and then she was quiet for a moment. And then she asked, "Did you bring your copy of the employment agreement?" I had. I keep important documents in 3 places. I know that sounds excessive. It is a habit I developed working in regulatory affairs adjacent roles for 2 decades. If something matters, you keep a physical copy at home, a scanned copy in a personal cloud account that has nothing to do with your employer, and a second physical copy in a safe deposit box. The original contract from 2004 was in the fireproof safe in our basement, and I had read that page 24 clause so many times in the previous 18 months that I could recite parts of it from memory. But I read it again that evening anyway, and then I called an attorney. Her name is Patricia Osei. She is a partner at a firm in Columbus that specializes in employment and corporate law. I had met her 3 years earlier through a professional association event. I had her cell number in my phone. I called at 7:45 p.m. and she picked up. I described the situation in under 5 minutes. She asked me to send her a photo of page 24. I did. She called me back in 12 minutes. "Marcus," she said, "where are you right now?" "Back porch." "Why?" "Because I want you to be sitting down when I tell you that this clause is almost certainly enforceable, and that if it is, you are looking at full accelerated vesting of every option in your grant." I was already sitting down. I gripped the arm of the porch chair. What does that mean in numbers? I asked. She told me to pull up my most recent equity statement. I did. She walked me through the calculation. The unvested options that had not yet reached their scheduled vesting date, the ones that would normally have been forfeited upon termination, represented at Hartwell's acquisition price per share approximately $340,000. $340,000, on top of the options that were already vested, which I would receive regardless. Patricia told me she would need until morning to review the full contract and confirm her analysis. She told me not to respond to any communications from Meridian's HR department until we spoke again. She told me not to discuss the clause with anyone. And then she said one more thing. Marcus, do you understand that if this triggers the way I think it does, they cannot close the Hartwell deal without resolving your compensation claim first? The representations and warranties in an acquisition agreement of this size will require clean employee compensation records. Your claim becomes a cloud on the transaction. I understood. I thanked her and hung up. Diane was watching me from across the porch. I looked at her. She had a cup of tea in both hands, and she was watching me the way she watches things, quietly, completely, not missing anything. Well, she said. Gerald Hartley wrote a very good contract, I said. She smiled. It was a small smile, and then it got a little bigger, and then she said, I always liked that man. Wednesday passed quietly. Patricia confirmed her analysis by 10 in the morning. She sent a formal letter to Meridian's general counsel by noon, notifying them of the accelerated vesting clause and requesting immediate confirmation that the company intended to honor it. She also sent a courtesy copy to the transaction attorneys at the firm handling the Hartwell acquisition. I spent most of Wednesday on the front porch reading a novel. Diane brought me lunch. The weather was unusually warm for October in Ohio. 68 degrees, clear sky, leaves on the red maple in the front yard finally turning. I finished the novel by evening. It was the first time I had finished a book in the middle of a work week in probably 15 years. At 4:47 p.m., my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was Richard Calloway. I let it ring. He called again at 5:03. I let it ring. He called again at 5:03. I let it ring. At 5:22, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize, and when I looked it up, it belonged to Meridian's general counsel. The text said, "Please call me at your earliest convenience regarding your employment matter." I texted Patricia. She called me immediately and told me to let her handle all communication. I was not to speak to anyone from the company directly. I went back to the front porch. Thursday morning, Patricia called me at 8:15. "They want to settle," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Already? Hartwell's acquisition team found out about the letter last night. They contacted Meridian's board this morning. Apparently, the transaction representations and warranties require certification that there are no outstanding or potential compensation disputes with senior employees. Your claim, if unresolved, puts the certification at risk. Meaning, Hartwell can walk from the deal or demand a price reduction to cover the liability. The board is now aware that Brandon's termination decision was made without legal review and without any awareness of your contract clause. Richard Calloway apparently did not read your employment agreement before instructing his son to hand you that envelope. I thought about that for a moment. 22 years. My employment agreement had been sitting in a file in the HR system for 22 years, and the CFO of the company had not read it before authorizing my termination 4 days before a $250 million acquisition closed. What does the settlement look like? I asked. Patricia told me. Full accelerated vesting, honored in cash at the acquisition price per share, paid at closing, no litigation, no admission of wrongdoing on either side, a mutual release. And one more thing that Patricia had added to the demand that Meridian had agreed to without negotiation. A letter of reference on company letterhead, signed by the CEO, attesting to my 22 years of service and contributions to the company's growth. They agreed to the letter? I asked. Immediately, Patricia said. They need this resolved by end of day tomorrow. Closing is Friday morning. I was standing in the kitchen when she told me all of this. Diane was at the table behind me with her coffee. I turned around and looked at her. They're settling, I said. She nodded once. She had not doubted it for a moment. I want to tell you about Friday morning because I think it matters. The deal closed. I know because Patricia texted me at 10:43 a.m. to say the settlement payment would be processed within 5 business days. $263 million changed hands. Hartwell Pharmaceutical acquired Meridian Biosciences. Somewhere in a conference room in Columbus or Boston or Zurich, people shook hands and signed documents and congratulated each other. I was not in that conference room. I was in Hocking Hill State Park, about an hour south of Columbus, standing on a trail with Diane. We had taken the day off. We had packed a cooler with sandwiches and driven down the night before and stayed at a cabin rental. The leaves down there were spectacular, deeper color than in the city, reds and oranges that looked almost artificial in the morning light. We walked for about 4 miles. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. At one point, standing on the overlook above Old Man's Cave, I waited for some feeling to arrive. Triumph, maybe. Or vindication. Something sharp and satisfying. I had imagined during those 96 hours that there would be a moment of clear, unambiguous victory, the kind of feeling you see in movies. Score swelling. Slow motion. It didn't come. What came instead was quieter. It felt more like the end of a long physical effort, the way your muscles feel after you have been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally set it down. Not euphoria, just the absence of the weight. Diane took my hand. We stood there for a while looking at the gorge. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am." She squeezed my hand. Gerald Hartley would have liked this story. He would have said I should have read the clause out loud to Brandon when he handed me the envelope. She laughed. It echoed a little off the rock walls. There were a few things I found out afterward, over the following weeks, through Patricia and through a former colleague who stayed in touch. Richard Calloway resigned from his CFO position 2 weeks after the deal closed. The circumstances were described internally as mutual agreement, which is the corporate language for something that was not mutual at all. Brandon's strategic integration advisor role was quietly eliminated during the post-acquisition restructuring. Brandon, as far as I know, is no longer with the combined company. The senior technical advisor role that Richard had wanted for his son, the role that I had essentially been removed to clear space for, was ultimately filled by a woman named Dr. Sandra Ewan from Hartwell's existing team in San Diego. She had spent 15 years in process development. She was excellent from everything I heard. The Hartwell integration team sent me a formal note through Patricia expressing regret about the circumstances of my departure and indicating that my contributions to the due diligence process had been valuable to the transaction. It was a carefully worded letter. I read it once and filed it. I am going to tell you the honest part now. The part that I didn't fully understand until it was over. I had defined a significant part of my identity around that company for 22 years. Not in a way that I would have admitted at the time, but in a way that was true. My expertise was Meridian's processes. My professional relationships were Meridian's relationships. My daily schedule, my sense of purpose, the particular satisfactions of the work, all of it was woven into that building and those projects and those people in ways I had not examined clearly. When Brandon handed me that envelope, I had felt, underneath the immediate shock and anger, something that I can only describe as a sudden groundlessness. Like a floor had disappeared. The clause gave me the financial outcome, but it did not give me back the 22 years, and it did not immediately answer the question of what I was going to do with the next phase of my life. Diane and I talked about that a lot during those weeks. We talked about it in the evenings on the back porch and on weekend drives, and during a longer trip we took to the North Carolina coast in November when the weather had turned cold and the beaches were empty and we had a rental cottage to ourselves for a week. We walked on cold sand every morning. We cooked dinners together. We talked more during that week than we had in years. Not because we had been not talking, but because there is a kind of conversation that only becomes possible when you have stepped outside the structure of your ordinary life. I decided not to look for another corporate position. I had enough with the settlement and the already vested options and what we had saved to be comfortable. I wasn't ready to call it retirement exactly. I am 54 and the word still feels strange. But I was ready to stop spending my best hours solving other people's problems under other people's timelines. I have been consulting since January. Independent work, companies that need help with FDA process documentation or stability protocol design, and they hire me by the project, and I work from home or from coffee shops or from wherever I feel like working that day. The work is the same work I have always done. The difference is that I decide when I do it and for whom. Last month, Diane and I drove up to Lake Erie for a long weekend. It was early spring. The lake was still rough and cold gray and enormous, the way it always is until June. We rented a small boat one afternoon. The fishing was not particularly good. We caught 2 small perch and threw them back. But we sat out there for 3 hours, and the sky was the pale clear blue that only exists at that latitude in April, and neither of us wanted to come in. On the drive home, Diane said, "I think Gerald would have liked today too." I thought about the old man, his precise language, his distrust of sentimentality, his belief that the right contract, written carefully enough, could hold something intact against forces that had no interest in fairness. He had been right about that. He would have complained about the perch, I said. Diane laughed. We drove the rest of the way home with the windows down, even though it was only 50 degrees, because the air smelled like the lake and neither of us wanted to stop smelling it yet. If you are somewhere in the middle of a situation like this, if you have given years to a company and you are starting to feel the particular chill of being made expendable, I want to say something to you directly. Read your contract, all of it, not just the compensation page, not just the title and the salary. Read the clauses on the last 10 pages that the HR person glossed over during onboarding. Read them the way a lawyer would read them, slowly, looking for what the words actually say rather than what you assume they say. The people who built the companies you work for, the original founders, the ones who stayed up late worrying about whether their work would survive them. Some of them wrote things into those agreements that were meant to protect you, not because they liked you personally, because they understood what loyalty costs and they believed it deserved a return. Gerald Hartley had never once told me directly that he valued my work. He was not that kind of person, but he had written it into a contract in 2004 and had it witnessed by an attorney who advised against it. And 22 years later, that document was still sitting in a fireproof safe in my basement, exactly where I had put it. Documents don't forget. People do. Keep your copies. Keep them in multiple places. And when someone who has been with the company for 14 months hands you an envelope on a Tuesday morning and tells you this decision came from leadership, take a breath, pick up your personal cell phone, not your work phone, and call the best employment attorney you know. Then go home and sit on the porch with your wife. The rest tends to take care of itself. I have thought about that moment on the overlook at Old Man's Cave many times since October. Standing there waiting for Triumph to arrive and finding something quieter instead. That quietness told me more about the previous 22 years than I had been willing to see while I was living inside them. What happened to Marcus was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was the direct result of choices made consistently over a very long time. Choices about integrity, about preparation, about the kind of person you decide to be when no one is rewarding you for it yet. Gerald Hartley did not write that clause because Marcus was charming or politically connected. He wrote it because Marcus showed up, did the work, and protected what had been entrusted to him year after year without any guarantee that it would ever matter. That is what I mean when I say the outcome was earned. Not in a single dramatic moment, but across thousands of ordinary ones. The decision to read a contract carefully in 2004. The habit of keeping important documents in 3 places. The discipline of building relationships with attorneys and professionals before you ever need them. None of those things feel heroic when you do them. They feel like maintenance, like caution, like the boring work that serious people do quietly, but they compound. And when the moment of crisis arrives, when someone who has been at the company for 14 months hands you an envelope and expects you to simply disappear, all of that quiet preparation becomes the ground you are standing on. Brandon and his father made the opposite choices. They moved fast without reading carefully. They assumed that power meant they did not need to understand the details. They treated a person's 22 years of work as an inconvenient obstacle to be removed on a Tuesday morning. And the consequence of those choices came back to them not through any act of revenge, not through anything Marcus did in anger, but through the simple mechanical operation of a contract that had been sitting in a file for 2 decades. The document did not forget. The document did not forget. The document did not forgive. The document simply said what it said, and the world organized itself accordingly. There is a kind of wisdom that only comes from taking the long view. It is the wisdom of understanding that how you treat people, how carefully you honor your commitments, how honestly you do your work when no one is watching. All of it is being recorded somewhere, even if only in the memory of the people around you and in the documents you sign. Richard Calloway had 22 years to read that employment agreement. He never did. Marcus read his own contract so many times he had memorized parts of it. That difference, that gap in diligence and respect, was the real source of everything that followed. The resilience that carried Marcus through those 96 hours was not built during those 96 hours. It was built over 2 decades of marriage, of honest work, of tending to the things that actually matter. When the floor disappeared, he did not fall because he had spent 22 years building something real underneath him. That is what integrity looks like when it is tested. Not loud, not dramatic, just solid, just there, just exactly what it was always going to be.